So I sent you a message with Prati. I was like, I'll highlight it. That's so funny. No, that's fine.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm very happy to have you all here, especially Levi. Levi wasn't here. It'd also be a cool get-together, but Levi makes it extra special. I don't know if you read the little blurb that I wrote about Levi in the event page, but when I asked him how I should describe him, so he said, just say I have superpowers. So I did that, and then I wrote a little bit something else. He was at a writer for a long time, 4 years with a bunch of us, and then went on to get a bachelor's in Jewish philosophy and Tanakh, and now studying at Tel Aviv University, also towards a PhD in Jewish philosophy. I'll let him say whatever else he wants, but should fit a few words. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Levi.
I love you.
People I've known for a while, really nice to see you all again. People I've never met before, slightly nicer to see you guys. How about you, Menashe? Yeah, I am studying at Tel Aviv University for my master's in Jewish philosophy. The plan is to write a master's and then a thesis and potentially a PhD on Rav Shagar. Rav Shagar is one of the people I'll be talking about tonight. He was a Dati Leumi rabbi. He started his sort of teaching careers at a hotel in the early 80s. He was Rosh Yeshiva for a year. Eventually he passed away in 2007, the head of Yeshivat Siach that he founded in the Gush area, and he is sort of known for his involvement in contemporary secular philosophy, existentialism, and then more famously he was later very into postmodernism. And I just think he's fascinating. We'll talk about him a little later tonight. Yeah, that's, I guess I made Aliyah 4 years ago at this point. I live here in Katamun with my wife and my daughter, who turned 1 yesterday. That's fun. No, English birthday. Hebrew birthday is like Yud Zayin B'Shvat, much for that. Okay, so just a little bit what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about a piece from Rabbi Nachman from Lekutei Moharan, a short piece dealing with Purim, and then look at how Rabbi Shagar and also Rabbi Nachman Froman dealt with that text. For general knowledge, Rabbi Nachman was a Hasidic rabbi who died in 1810, around the age of 40, if I recall. He was fairly controversial in his time. Very interesting figure throughout, grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, all kinds of just fascinating and radical things that got him into trouble with a lot of people around him at the time, and has since he died really become a huge phenomenon. Rav Froman was, like Rav Shagar, a Dati Leumi rabbi who died very recently. He passed away in 2013. He was very involved in sort of Israeli culture outside of just the yeshivot he taught in. He actually was fairly well known even in the secular crowd, particularly for his peace activism. He was very into sort of grassroots peace talk as opposed to just trying to focus on the political action at the level of governments. He's very well known for particularly going to meet with Arafat and leaders of Hamas and things like that. And talking with them about religion and things. He procured an Arabic language copy of Moharan for one of the defense ministers of Hamas at one point because they had been talking about it and the guy was interested. So yeah, interesting figures. Both Rav Shagar and Rav Froman were instrumental in the introduction of Rabbi Nachman into Dati Leumi society writ large. So they both address this piece of Rabbi Nachman in their own similar but distinct ways, and we'll see them in a little bit. Any questions thus far? If I at some point mumble or I'm just going too fast or you have questions, just stop me. The first thing I want to look at is a famous Gemara that most people are familiar with, at least outside, if not inside. And I want to look at this because while I haven't been able to confirm this, I strongly believe Rabbi Nachman is sort of working off this Gemara. And I will just read this to get us started. From the Gemara Shabbat, the Torah says, "And they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain. Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama or Bar Chasa said, "This teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain over the Jews like a tub, and said to them, 'If you accept the Torah, excellent, and if not, there will be your burial.' Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, 'From here there is a substantial challenge to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people can claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah, and it is therefore not binding.' Rava said, 'Even so, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh, as it is written, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them.' And he taught, the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion at Sinai." So famously, the Gemara is saying that the Jews accepted the Torah again out of free will at the time of Achashverosh, where they had accepted it under coercion, but against their will, perhaps, at Har Sinai. Anything to clarify with that Gemara? Right? Great. I don't want to focus on it so much because that's just sort of the background for what we're going to talk about. Anyone feel like reading the Rabbi Nachman piece, which is next? Yaakov.
After Purim, Rabbi Nachman Lekutei Moharan. After Purim, we read the portion called Para as a preparation for Pesach. For we read Para in order to be careful with regards to purification from the impurity of a corpse, in order to be pure for Pesach. In the beginning, it has the aspect of Pur, Lot, and Purim is also named after Pur. Afterwards, it is read as Para, since Purim is certainly on the way to Pesach. This is like the verse, shiur, his lips are lilies dripping with myrrh. Lips are like Pesach, which is a homonym of Pesach, a speaking mouth. Shoshana, speaking lilies, is Esther, according to the Zohar, and they have equivalent numerical values. Dripping with myrrh refers to Mordechai, who is hinted at in the translation of the verse, more dror, from the language of freedom, like the freedom of Pesach. Therefore, the letters of Purim are hinted at in the issues of Pesach. In the verse, 7 days shall you eat matzah, as I have commanded in its time in the month of Aviv, in which you left Egypt, and you shall not encounter me empty-handed. The initial letters of the last 5 words spell Purim, for Purim is on the way to Pesach, so that they could be careful with regards to chametz. Here Rabbi Nachman stopped in the middle of the issue and did not reveal more.
Okay, so thank you, Yaakov, for reading that just run-on list of connections. That's a sort of typical Rabbi Nachman piece in Lekutei Moharan. They vary in length. This piece is relatively short, but large expanses of them will be, this is like that, is like this, is like that, often based off of connections like he's making here, where the various words of the pasuk he quotes from Shir Shirim all sound like other words from Esther and Mordechai, etc. The point he's trying to make in all of that requires sort of stepping back and just looking at what he's doing from the beginning, where he starts off talking about Purim is connected to Para, just based off of the sound. Purim is from the word pur. Para is read shortly thereafter, and Para is connected to Pesach. We read Para in advance of Pesach. So all of these connections allow Rabbi Nachman to connect Purim to Pesach. That's all that's really important to take away in the broad sense of this passage so far. And then he ends that passage by saying, so Purim is on the way to Pesach, so that they could be careful with regard to chametz. So Purim is connected to Pesach, and in particular, Purim somehow helps be careful with chametz on Pesach. Anyone for the obvious what that might mean? How does Purim help you be careful with chametz on Pesach?
I would think it makes it harder to be careful with chametz.
Yeah?
What do you mean?
So I'm familiar.
I don't know, you finish all your alcohol.
There we go. Every Suda I have ever been at, someone says, don't worry, it's a mitzvah of beer chametz, that we're drinking all the alcohol.
You're right, that's true.
So, well, people say, oh, once Purim starts, that's when the mitzvah of beer chametz starts, shloshim yom kodem chag, whatever. But that would be a sort of obvious explanation of what he might mean. Any other thoughts on how Purim might help you prepare for Pesach?
Chametz is like hesitation, like chametz. Sometimes people translate like achmatza.
Yeah.
Like so, and Purim is, I guess, an opposite theme, like simcha. I don't know.
No, I think that's actually we're going to see things. I think basically working off of that in Froman and Rav Shagar. So he's saying that chametz is often connected to the Hebrew phrase lahachmitz, which related to the way things ferment over time and spoil. You have waited too long, and you have chametz has become chametz, and you have lost out on whatever the opportunity was.
Point that I've heard a few people make is that just in terms of the story, Purim is the opposite of Pesach. Purim is supposed to be that we're celebrating some big miracle that we were saved, but actually nothing happened. There was no nace. We were never actually in trouble. Like, it wasn't like we were saved in Egypt and then we were saved. Nothing ever happened. There's no God. There's no anything. And Pesach is like all of the God, all of the miracles. We were enslaved and they were killing us, and now we're free and we're not. And so story-wise, they're exactly that.
They both end with a lot of dead enemies.
It's accurate. Thank you, Tzvi, for really lighting the mood. Yeah. Lewis, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's awesome. Right, his point is that they're totally sort of opposite situations that we were in, and that goes back also to the Gemara that we were looking at, that the acceptance of the Torah at Har Sinai comes against the background of all of the miracles and all of the salvation and just massive historical changes enacted by God, versus Purim, where there's none of that sort of obvious controlling of history and no sort of obvious divine presence involved. Anyone else?
I'd say the stories are fairly similar. In other words, unless I can't say what everybody's saying.
Locus.
But both of them, during the plot of the story, it's bad for the Jewish people. Mitzrayim is slavery, and Purim is trying to get them to bow to idols, or they did actually bow to idols. So one may be physical, the other one may be spiritual. But at the end of the day, both of them have a salvation. Both of them have, that positive shiur that comes out of it.
Right, so I think that is part of how you have to sort of nuance what Lewis was saying, which is that the two are both, they're like parallel. They make the same sort of basic movement from darkness to light, from trouble to salvation, but one of those movements happens, under the revelatory experience of the plagues, leading to Har Sinai and the revelation of Torah, versus one of them happens without any sort of open miracles and leading to what the Gemara describes not as the revelation of Torah, but as the acceptance of Torah. Yeah, so what's your name?
Aliza.
Lisa.
I know I just got here, so I'm sorry. But I think also something that's really interesting, certain contrast, is within Purim, the whole story of Purim happened because the Jews of Babel didn't return back to Israel. Whereas then we see Pesach, it's like literally the salvation, and like so clearly can see God's hand in the Jews like returning to that state. Whereas in Purim, it's interesting because like, there's a lot of things where if you really understand the background, it's actually like it's very bittersweet. Like we celebrate this, we celebrate Jews still being able to be alive, but if you look at the source of why they're even there, it's the Jews that decided not to return.
Yeah, so that's definitely, Purim is a very exilic story. It happens entirely in exile. It's essentially a story about how Jews rise to power in exile, when you might have said it should have been a story of Jews going back to Israel.
The Jews that were
right,
still
the Jews
there
did.
was the ones who chose
Right.
not to return.
There's the happens at the time of Ezra, roughly. That's another one to add to that, but no, it's definitely, as opposed to the story of everyone sort of leaving Egypt, that's what you're saying. Yeah. Any other thoughts so far?
I mean, it's really just a concept, as to inflate on. Sorry, what's your name?
Louis.
To expand on your point, it's the concept of a human story versus a godly story. Pesach, we have no choice. We're literally, God, says, Moshe, if it was up to us, we would never have left Egypt. God really has to pull us out. Whereas here it's a concept of human choice, freedom, and because of that, not all of us had accepted Torah at the same time, not all of us admit to it. It's much more of a mixed feeling, but it's our choice. It's a concept of, I've chosen this freely, not no one forced me into it. Right,
so that's actually a very interesting point you raised in the middle of that. Is that human versus divine aspect is really sort of the overall thrust of the Gemara. Part of that is that God can sort of compel everyone to experience the revelation of the Torah,
But then
versus
it's not
once
us.
it's left up to people. It also then is the question of who's going to accept and who's not going to accept. Interestingly, God may not get a choice. There's a line, like who exactly is accepting it. There's a line in the Megillah of a lot of the enemies of the Jews, mityahadim. And one of the understandings of what that means is they're converting. So as opposed to the revelation at Har Sinai, where God gets to choose which nation gets the Torah, it's interesting that even non-Jews might have accepted the Torah at the time of Ahasuerus. Anything else before we move on?
I think one cute idea of Paul, it's like in Purim, Ahasuerus is reading through his book, and he's like going through like the different things that like people did for him and like different actions, like especially before Pesach, like this whole like chosek words that like we're supposed to look over our actions and like clean the chametz from within us. So the same way Ahasuerus was reading his stuff, we also do on Pesach whatever we did.
Very interesting. I know we met. I have to know your name again. What is it?
Rachel.
Rachel, right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I want to move on to the very end of Rabbi Nachman here, which is going to be important as well for where we go for the rest of the shiur. But I just wanted to keep in mind the various things we've talked about here. Well, most of them will come back, if not in the texts we've seen, then in our discussion of them. Okay, so Rabbi Nachman Froman, from his book Chasidim Tzochakim Mizeh, a small little book full of mostly pretty short, to the point little sayings. Sometimes they are hilarious, but also very serious. And so this is a fun one that talks about this piece of Rabbi Nachman. Someone want to read?
So Rabbi Nachman often stops in the middle of a topic. However, in one place he actually stops right in the middle of a sentence. For in the beginning...
Oh, wait, sorry. We skipped to the very end of Rabbi Nachman. I thought we were going to read, which is actually what there's no reference. So that wouldn't have made any sense. So Rabbi Nachman finishes. He says, "For in the beginning, all of the beginnings began at Pesach, and therefore the mitzvot are all in memory of the exodus from Egypt. But now," and then Rabbi Nachman puts in parentheses, and he didn't finish. Rabbi Nachman said, "and now," something is different than the way they were before, but he doesn't actually explain what he meant. So yeah, DJ.
So, getting back to this, he stops right in the middle of a sentence saying, "For in the beginning, all the beginnings began at Pesach, and therefore the mitzvot are all in memory of the exodus from Egypt. But now," it's discussed in Lekutei Moharan, his intent was that, in classical Judaism, all of the commandments memorialized the exodus from Egypt. But now we have reached a new era, an era of laughter and freedom, chofesh. Until now, all the commandments were very serious. Pesach is about pathos. The Torah has lots of pathos, and it's very serious. Now we have a new era, a new Torah, the Torah of the land of Israel, the Torah of the Mashiach. All the commandments memorialize the laughter of Purim, not the pathos of Pesach. To be or not to be is a serious and weighty question. However, Shakespeare wrote in the very same play that the whole world is a stage, that everyone upon it are players, and so that everyone is a game. Do you hear me asking the most important question there is in life, whether or not to live? This question is simply a joke. It's a game. It's just a game.
Okay. Let's stop here for now. So Rabbi Froman is working off the very end of Rabbi Nachman that we saw quickly, where Rabbi Nachman says, in the beginning, all of the beginnings were from Pesach. And now, and he doesn't finish, but Rabbi Nachman started by saying, there's on the one hand Pesach, on the other hand there's Purim. So Rabbi Froman rather watchfully concludes, and now all the beginnings are from Purim, is how the sentence was supposed to finish. And if Rabbi Nachman said, all the beginnings began at Pesach, and therefore all of the mitzvot were in memory of the exodus from Egypt, Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now all of the mitzvot are Zecher le not Yetziat Babel, Zecher le Yeshuat Purim. Froman is going to sort of work with this opposition between Purim and Pesach, and say, where once we did mitzvot in memory of Yetziat Mitzrayim, now we're doing the memory of the salvation at Purim. And the distinction he makes is between seriousness and levity and jokes. Yetziat Mitzrayim is full of pathos, of emotional energy, and things are super important, and everything happens as God decides, when God decides, versus Purim. Purim is a joke. If you read the Megillah, there are plenty of moments that seem to be sort of full of irony. My favorite one is when the decree goes out that so the Jews are going to be killed. Everyone is, freaking out, and Mordecai is like ripping his clothes and mourning, and Esther hears, and she's freaking out, and she reaches out to Mordecai and says, "Why are you dressed so badly?" And you realize Esther was upset because Mordecai was dressed badly, but like she doesn't actually know yet what's happened. There's a sort of dramatic irony where the reader knows how upsetting things are, but Esther doesn't know yet. And when you first see she's upset, you think it's because she's heard about the decree, but she hasn't yet. And famously, there are things like where Haman thinks, when Ahasuerus is saying, what should we do for the person the king wants to reward? And Haman thinks it's about him, and it's actually not. So the Purim story is full of those. It's full of jokes, and that's certainly manifests in how we celebrate the holidays. We celebrate Purim as a day of laughter and jokes and whatever. There's a tosot about people stealing things as a kind of joking thing, which is interesting. But it's all Purim, by contrast, very serious. Pesach, by contrast, very serious, very formal. So we have the full progression of the Magid and the Haggadah, which can be lots of fun, and there's lots of things that we put into it to make it fun for kids, but there's still a lot of very serious emotional energy involved in that's not necessarily involved in Pesach, in Purim. And so Froman is trying to put all of that behind the mitzvot. He says, once upon a time, we kept mitzvot very seriously. We said this mitzvot is of the utmost importance that I keep it. It's of utmost importance that I do this thing at this moment when I'm supposed to do it. And when nowadays, and not clear when now is per se, other than the fact that it's now. Like it doesn't say when he starts. But now there's a lot less intensity behind mitzvot. I'm a lot less worried about it. Anyone have any thoughts on why they're
saying there should be less intensity, or there is that exists?
That's a good question. It's definitely phrased as that's what exists. But this is very much a teaching. When Rabbi Nachman said it to his Hasidim, and when Rav Froman said it, he was telling people what he thinks is the proper way to just understand mitzvot. So even if you don't feel like everything's kind of light and relaxed and we can joke about things, he's saying maybe you should.
Rav Binny's discussion of freedom, I remember correctly, he discusses chofesh as a word that does not exist within the Tanakh, as something that's a modern creation, concept of running away from purpose or running away from something. Is this word here within that realm, or?
So, yes. We're going to see more of that in the Rav Shagar piece, where he creates an opposition between, he takes Rabbi Nachman's opposition between Pesach and Purim, and makes that an opposition between Cherut and Chofesh. But in Rav Froman's idea of freedom is very much about this idea of not taking things so seriously. That there is a sense of moving away from the importance of your own actions and not being super concerned about what you're doing. That makes you free, in a sense. It actually comes, he says, through commitment to God, commitment to a spouse. There's a degree of living in that commitment and relaxing away from am I doing the right thing, just being focused on the other person that makes you free. So it's very much that relaxation and flowing is what he means by chofesh.
Froman always talks about that in Chassidim Tzorchikim. He always talks about shidduch.
Yeah,
and,
so 100% obsessed with marriage. I actually met someone who sort of struggled with that when they read the book. But I think it's important to understand that he sees marriage not as a metaphor, as a symbol or anything, but as one example also of your relationship with God and that sort of not being so focused on yourself. Right. So even if you're not super concerned, you don't share the same pressing concern he does about getting married, he many times there describes it as the main focus of the Torah or the Zohar or whatever. If you don't have that same sense of weight there, I think it's still valuable to take his understanding of the ability to commit to something besides yourself and not stay so intensely focused on what you're doing.
Right. He says once that I think he says that he questions what single men are doing.
He questions the value of teaching Torah to single men.
Right.
There's no chance of possibly understanding Torah.
Because you're not going to understand it.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions, thoughts, clarifications before we move
I'm a
forward?
little confused. I don't really have such a question. I'm just confused because Rabbi Nachman says that Purim's on the way to Pesach, so it makes it seem like Pesach is the main, and Purim is like leading up to it, and then Froman kind of derives from that.
So some of that is because I accidentally jumped the gun to the Froman piece, and we ran through the end of the Rabbi Nachman piece.
Okay.
Rabbi Nachman really does build this strong connection between Pesach and Purim, based on the idea that Purim is sort of on the way to Pesach. And then he just flips it around quickly at the end. He says, once upon a time, that's how things were. Once upon a time, everything started at Pesach,
But
and now...
implying that
now things start from Purim. Minimally speaking, like the things start from Purim is a sort of logical extrapolation from what he was saying. Minimally, the very structure of once, in the beginning, things started from Pesach, and now, so now we know things are different now. And it makes sense that he was going to say things start from Purim.
My other question, you could not answer. Pesach feels like a bigger. I guess whatever. This is what we're here to overturn. But Pesach feels like a bigger holiday. Like it makes sense that all the mitzvah would be Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim because also Pesach was the start of the nation, right? It was the birth of a nation, and so whether or not it's and laughter doesn't feel like a big enough theme to encompass everything, to be the most. What's the word I'm looking for? Seed for all the other mitzvot.
I think you're exactly right. But I think that's the radicalness of Froman, Rebbe Nachman, and this Gemara.
Okay.
All of this is based on the fact that there's a lot happening at Pesach. That the lack of free will described there could be from there literally being a mountain over your head, or just from all of the stuff going on. From Moshe coming and saying, I represent the God of your fathers, and my stick turns into a snake. And God, doing all of the plagues, and bringing the people out, and appearing at Har Sinai, and all of those things. There's a lot of energy there.
Yeah.
And that energy, needs to get processed and done something with it. It happens makes a lot of sense to sort of focus that into the mitzvot. And Froman, Rabbi Nachman, the Gemara, coming along and saying, okay, but now we're moving that, right? All of the energy that got the Torah started, let's restart the Torah at Purim, where you don't have that energy. What does it mean to start over without all of that?
Okay.
Anyone else?
Without the energy
of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the plagues, of Revelation, all of those things that just shock you and wow you and fill you up with emotion and devotion and things like that. All of the emotional energy of Yetziat Mitzrayim and Har Sinai.
Like the motivation, inspiration.
Yeah.
Do that.
Like the religious experience.
So the Purim is the new motivation or whatever.
Well, it's starting over, but where's the motivation? That's what this is trying to get at, is that you lack that same sense of, I'm doing it because of all of these things that have happened to me. And so, for the Gemara, that means I'm doing it because I chose to. I wasn't forced, I did it out of free will. For Rabbi Nachman doesn't really go into it. For Froman, we're going to see right now. He says, okay, it's all levity and jokes now, but where does that come from? And what provides that form of, accepting the mitzvot? Where does that come from? Does someone want to leave?
It's not like an excitement. It's really just doing mitzvot because we kind of have to, or else we're dead.
We'll have to, because we're dead if the mountain's over our head.
Right.
But one of the ways that Gemara has been taken, and certainly sort of just thinking about Yetziat Mitzrayim writ large, even before you get to that moment described in the Gemara, is that you don't have a lot of choice because you can't ignore what's happening. Something is happening to you that is just beyond obvious. You simply can't be questioned. God is appearing. He's taking you out of Egypt, out of slavery. It's all very much decided by God.
It's kind of just like you have a piece in front of you, you have to eat it.
Yeah, I think it's a lot like that. Okay, it's either trying like pizza and Purim. I don't know, Coke.
It's wrong thing that we can't eat pizza.
It's true. Hey, matzah pizza. It's very good.
This is true.
Okay, Menashe, would you read the last paragraph from Froman?
From sure.
There is something.
There's something that takes priority over the question of whether or not to live.
It even takes priority over saving a life, which is so important that it overrides Shabbat. What is this thing that takes priority over saving a life? Being before God, being before God in this world and the world to come, being before God and knowing that everything we have done in our lives is a joke. Life, death, it's all a joke before God.
So that's a crazy thing to say. Like, that's a really intense statement. Part of it is worth just sort of noting is about his Breslov context. It very much comes as a strong idea in Rabbi Nachman. The best example of it, of sort of it's all a joke, is Maaseh Mimelech Anav, the story of the humble king, which just talks a lot about this idea of there's sort of an unreality to the things we do. He's saying that all of the mitzvot and things are all these sort of jokes. It's a big sort of Rabbi Nachman thing. Rabbi Nachman talks about this story, Sipor HaPaltin, the story of the palace, where a king hires these people to paint pictures of his palace, and one of the two painters works really hard and makes this beautiful painting, and the other painter makes a mirror, and he just mirrors the other guy's thing. And the king, well, there are similar stories like that where, from outside of Judaism, where the king punishes the guy who made the mirror by killing him, or punishes him by only paying him with fake gold and things like that. For Rabbi Nachman, that's the guy who really gets it, and the king gives him not just his payment, but also the other guy's payment. And it's something for Rabbi Nachman in the ability to make a joke that's incredibly powerful. And what Froman is saying is that comes from the sensation there's something more important than the actions and things we're doing here. And mitzvot are very much our actions. And when you put all of the weight on the mitzvot and say they're super important, what you've done is put all of the importance on us. You said is that we're what's really important. And instead, what's important, what Froman is saying, is being before God. There's a famous saying from the Kutzker that, Misnagdim serve the Shulchan Aruch and Hasidim serve God. That is basically the idea that Froman is trying to get at, is that the mitzvot, they have to be jokes. They can't be super important. Because if they're super important, then they're idols. Then you've made something more important than just being before God. He's not saying, don't keep the mitzvot. He's not saying that. What he's saying is that when you keep the mitzvot, you have to do it, ironically. You have to wink while you're doing it. And say, this is really important because God wants me to do it, not because these actions in and of themselves are important. And he says, even, it's very powerful for me, this one line, but being before God in this world and the world to come. That, it's not this world that's important, and it's not the next world that's important. What's important is being before God. Is the things you do and the way you live your life are all contextualized by God. You say, this is what, defines me and what I'm interested in, and I'm being oriented towards God in all of the things I do. And part of what that does is it means I can relax a little bit. It's not so, I don't have to get so worked up about all the things that are going on. I'll relax. God's in charge. God knows what's going on. It doesn't mean, things are going to go super well. But it means that you trust in, not things going well again, but in the relative importance and unimportance of things before God. That you can relax and not worry so much about things. Questions? Yes?
What does being before God mean if you don't have, if you don't care about the mitzvah as much as, I don't know, maybe Eisen Minayud, believe we're supposed to? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to act if it doesn't matter?
Well, like I said, he doesn't mean don't keep the mitzvot.
Yeah.
But he means recognize that the mitzvot are themselves not innately important. The mitzvot are important because they're part of your being in a relationship with God. But whether or not you say daven every day, or whether or not you blanking on all of the mitzvot all of a sudden. There are so many of them. But the mitzvot you do are important, but not their importance pales in comparison to the way you do them. They're not important if you're not doing them as part of a relationship with God. I think you can, debate what that's true, if it's true for all mitzvot, or if there's different types of mitzvot, etc. But what he's trying to tell you is that if you're trying to be in a relationship with God, then making the mitzvot more important than that relationship is very problematic.
I think another dimension that Froman, and definitely like Rabbi Nachman would add, is that if it's like stressing you out, that you're not like being happy, and you're not like enjoying your life, not in a superficial way necessarily, but in like a deeper personal joy type of way. I think that would also kind of like negate almost like the strictness of the mitzvot that you're doing. Like whether you did it like Mahadrin min Mahadrin is like not as important if you're not like happy about it. If you're not like dancing before God, then it's not like maybe that's something that they would add based on their emphasis on like serving Hashem the Simcha.
I think so, but I also think they would say that those things are sort of not necessarily connected. I mean, that statement is definitely true for Froman and Breslov, but simultaneously, both Froman and Breslov were some of the most intense about keeping halacha super strictly. So there's a sense of irony, doing things sort of while being aware of their unimportance, that come together. That you can be super strict without it weighing on you, because your super strictness is not, you're not super worried about your strictness. Your strictness, and you enjoy that, but you're not concerned that, if I don't, do everything super perfectly with every chumrah I can think of, then tragedy will befall me and I haven't kept the mitzvah correctly. No, that what's important is you're trying to be in a relationship with God. And as part of that, you're going to be as strict as you feel is appropriate, which often for Froman and definitely for a lot of Breslov is very strict.
Right.
But that's not where the emphasis of your relationship is. Make sense?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, you're saying that to kind of recognize the mitzvah are a way in which to serve God. That recognizing that it's not a mitzvah unto themselves, but it's rather a way to serve God.
Yeah. If you make the mitzvah more important than what they're for in being in a relationship with God, then I think the best example would be the Meir Shiloach, who calls it Pesel Masecha. You have made an idol by making the mitzvah more important than God.
Question: is that saying that like mitzvah like serve Shagar, serve Hashem? Where's that from? Just like
it's attributed to the Kotzker Rebbe. I have not myself looked into the accuracy of that attribution, and it's the kind of thing that would
around it. I don't know.
Anyone else?
I like the analogy of like the play a lot. Like I feel because a play is like it's not like what you're seeing really or hearing. It's about the idea. It's the story behind it. It's like kind of bigger than the actors and the kind of like fall into the. You know what I mean about a play? Like you're not looking at actors or set. You're like, so it's kind of a face to a whole world beyond, and that's also a way of like seeing the mitzvah. Like it's not. I don't know. He referenced the play. He said that it was like a play.
So he is focusing mostly on the to be or not to be alongside all the worlds of stage. That those two things go together. I think what he's trying to get at with all the worlds of stage is that it's not the thing itself. Like the mitzvot aren't the most real, because the same way a play is not real life. It's something that's sort of going on stage. But I think also in that context, you do the play for a reason. And if you thought the play was all that mattered, I mean, I don't know what that would look like. You would play actors who would just go up on stage and never stop performing. Like
you're crazy if you're always acting. Then you're crazy.
So Rabbi point is that as actors performing the mitzvot, we need to recognize that it's a play, that it's not, the most real life. That we're doing it for a reason. You play for an audience, you do mitzvot for God.
Such as some imprompts needed.
Sorry, what?
Such as some imprompts is needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So saying that like it's Purim that's going to give you traction in that sort of relationship to God, where Pesach was giving you traction in a relationship with God.
Exactly.
That's more by the books and straight.
Froman is saying that what happens at Purim is we recognize that all the world's a stage. That there's something more real behind all of the mitzvot and things. I think in some sense he's also getting at it with the life, death, it's all a joke before God. Because you're getting at what I talked about before, that the Megillah is full of jokes and irony. It's sort of a weird thing to be happening in a book, the underlying drama of which is genocide. That it's a really funny book about genocide. So I think the point is that the Purim contrasts those things. It contrasts the ability to have a good time and make light of things with the ultimately, scariest and most important things. And that what Froman is trying to get at here is the all-pervasive ability to relax and to take things, lightly, even before questions of life and death. You don't have to be always worried about, what's going to happen. He's not saying don't protect yourself and take care of yourself or act intelligently. Just that when you do, also relax a little bit and take a deep breath and know that, whether or not things are going to be okay is not the most important thing. That your actions right now, the things you're doing, are not the most important things in the world.
But then it's worth noting that Froman was like the most meticulous halacha,
Yeah.
more than all the other rabbis in Onia.
Right. That's right. I think there is a sense in which they go hand in hand. That there's a degree of obsessive is not the right word, of just you're so immersed in halacha and Judaism as a way of halacha as a way of life that you're so wrapped up in it that it becomes like second nature. You're not consciously worried about how important it is because it's just everything about you, and you. The same way that we take lots of things for granted and they're not so important, that are, unfortunately, for most of us, that's not halacha. But we all have things about us. A good example is that, when I lived in the States, I had access to a car to drive all the time. It was not something I thought was super important or I thought was very significant. And now that I live here and I don't have a car, there are often times where I really wish I had that. And the things that are just, second nature to you, they're constantly around you and things like that, you can take them a little less seriously without them, disappearing. That Froman, if he took halacha lightly, didn't mean he didn't keep it. It just meant that he, understood that it wasn't the most important thing. That there was, what was important was that halacha was before God. Okay. If you were still with me, I'd like to take a look at Rav Shagar, get down to the Cherut Chofesh distinction that DJ mentioned earlier. Does anyone want to read? Okay. To understand this piece from Rabbi Nachman, the piece we've been looking at, which I think I forgot to say, is from Lekutei Moharan Tinyana, the second volume of Lekutei Moharan. It's the 74th piece there. Lekutei Moharan Tinyana, Ayin Dalet. So this Rav Shagar piece is from a book of Drashot on Pesach that was put out. It's from an essay called Chofesh V'Cherut. I think it's dealing with questions of what is freedom and how do we define freedom. It was something that Rav Shagar was involved in a lot. The big book of his thought they put out, Luchot Shivrei Luchot, and then the English book of his translations they put out last year from Magid, both feature an essay called Chofesh V'Kodesh, Holiness and Freedom, that is just all about this topic. What does it mean to be free? What are the different ways of talking about and thinking about freedom? So Rav Shagar here is going to pick up Rabbi Nachman's distinction between Purim and Pesach and the connection between them and see them as models of different types of freedom. It's going to be a little bit awkward because he uses the words Chofesh and Cherut, which in English both translate as freedom. And in translating this, I sort of try to make that as clear as possible, and you'll see how I did that. To understand this piece from Rabbi Nachman, we have to distinguish between Chofesh and Cherut. Rabbi Nachman teaches that Chofesh is an introductory step which creates the Cherut of Pesach. More dror from the language of freedom, Cherut, like the freedom of Pesach, the Cherut of Pesach. Purim and Pesach parallel Chofesh and Cherut. Purim, when we celebrate the lottery, and man's anarchic freedom is chofesh, is when we freely choose the freedom, cherut, of Pesach, of personal essence and identity. This is an experience of Jewishness as a self-enclosed world, which finds its justification in itself. It is the experience of divine chosenness. For Rav Kook, the anarchic, Purim-style freedom, chofesh, let us elevate our nature, our Pesach-style freedom, our cherut. Rabbi Nachman here says otherwise. He says that anarchic freedom, chofesh, enables us to create cherut freedom. We can create our very nature. This path of creation does not depend on the facts, it creates them. Freedom, as Sartre understood it, therefore exists even within holiness. I'm just going to read to the end of it. We are therefore faced with two paths. There is the path of be who you are, but there's also the more radical path, the ability to create your freedom, your cherut, your I. Perhaps this was what Rabbi Nachman meant by the cryptic line that appears at the end of the teaching, for in the beginning, all the beginnings began at Pesach. And therefore the mitzvot are all in memory of the exodus from Egypt. But now, today, all the beginnings start from Purim. So Rav Shagar is creating two types of freedom. On the one hand, there's freedom that he identifies with Rav Kook, cherut, the freedom to be who you are. And on the other hand, freedom that he identifies with Rabbi Nachman, with Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, and the freedom to create who you are. Anyone have any thoughts on that before I go further? If that's what he might mean. Okay, so he says here that cherut is a freedom of personal essence and identity. It's Jewishness as a self-enclosed world which finds its justification in itself. Freedom of cherut is I'm Jewish, and I want to be Jewish. I want to express who I am. The ability to do mitzvot as Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim takes seriously the fact that God made us His people at Yetziat Mitzrayim and Har Sinai, and that who we are is God's people. That there's just an innate thing inside of us that makes us Jewish. We're not Jewish, He finds justification in itself. We're not Jewish because of something outside of us. We're Jewish because it's something that exists inside of us. And if you really want to be who you are, you're going to do mitzvot. That self-expression for a Jew looks like Torah and mitzvot. That this is something Rav Kook talked about a lot. Rav Kook lived at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the era of freedom as a modern ideal. That people were going to be free and liberated, and we were to liberate the world, and that freedom was the best way for people to live. That if you lived freely, everything would be good. And that's what Rav Kook really sort of found a space for in Judaism, is the idea that if I am free to be who I am, I will be good, I will be holy, I will follow the mitzvot, I will care for other people, that's just who I am inside. And consequently, if you're not being good, if you're Jewish and you're not following the mitzvot, you're out of touch with who you are. That if you feel a little lost, it's because you're not in touch with who you are, and being Jewish, that means not keeping the mitzvot. He has a famous piece in Orot HaKodesh, playing off of a line from Yechezkel. Yechezkel says, Yad Hashem hayta alai v'ani b'tol hagolah. The hand of God was upon me, and I was in the exile. Rav Kook says, Ha'ani b'tol begolah. The I was in exile. That Jewish history is, he goes from Adam to the people, the Jewish people of Chet Egel. The Jewish people is a history of Jews not being in touch with who they are, and therefore sinning. That Adam sinned because he didn't listen to himself, he listened to someone outside himself. And that's what sin is. It's always a process of not being true to yourself. So that's Rav Shagar's cherut. Cherut, the freedom of Pesach, is to recognize God made us Jews. And we want to be free and express ourselves. That means doing Torah and mitzvot. The problem is, and it's a problem that I always felt every time I've learned that Rav Kook, is that for me, keeping Torah and mitzvot doesn't feel like self-expression. I've never done a mitzvah and been like, oh right, that feels natural. That feels like it's not something I'm listening to outside of me, it's not something I'm choosing to take up from outside me. It does not feel like the thing he's talking about, that comes from inside you ultimately. So in place of that, Rav Shagar proposes a freedom that doesn't assume that you're Jewish in some sort of mystical sense inside you. He says that what it means to become like Jewish, to be Jewish on the inside, is to make yourself Jewish on the inside. That you get to choose who you are. And he talks a lot about the French philosopher Sartre, but what's important for us here is just that ability to choose who you are. That you're not stuck being someone who you were ahead of time, which might mean that you don't choose to be Jewish. That's not everyone chooses to follow Torah and mitzvot just because they were born Jewish, and not every secular Jew feels super alienated from themselves. But it also means that we get to choose to be Jewish. That being Jewish isn't something we're forced to do because who we are inside. That we have no choice but Judaism or alienation. That we can choose to follow Torah and mitzvot. And even he says here, we can choose to create our chirut, that we can choose to make ourselves into people who really do identify with the Torah and mitzvot. And he doesn't say it explicitly. I think Rav Shagar here is picking up on the short line from Rabbi Nachman about Purim actually helps us keep the issue of chametz on Pesach. That there can be a feeling of hachmatzah. Lewis said that. The feeling of hachmatzah, of fermenting, of spoiling, when you feel like, oh, I'm doing this because it's who I am. I was born into this family, and it's just how we do things. And that we want to avoid that feeling of, having to let things keep going the way they are, even though they don't feel good, they don't feel right, they don't identify with them. The trick is to take a minute to step back and really think, is this what I want to do? And if it is, then choose it and embrace it and identify with it. And that is what he's saying is at the basis of mitzvot after Purim. Is that Purim, there's no moment of God deciding, you're my nation, here's my Torah, you're going to do it, I'm going to put you in the land where you're going to do it. It's just the Jews. It's us deciding, do we want to be Jewish? And the Gemara in Shabbat says, they chose to do what they had already been doing. At Har Sinai, they were forced, and they were still doing it because they had once upon a time been forced. But suddenly they're in exile, and as you pointed out, they haven't come back the way they're supposed to, but they have a moment where they can choose what to do. No one, held up divine salvation and said, you cannot deny this happened, you have to keep mitzvot. So they get to choose, and they choose to do it. And that there's something much more important, much more freeing, certainly binding in the Gemara, but for Rav Shagar, much more freeing about the ability to step back and say, maybe I don't, identify with this already, but I want to. I want to be Jewish in every meaning of the word. And that's, what he says today. That today, all beginnings start from Purim. Everything we do starts from this sense of freedom. No one's forcing us to be Jewish. Even here in Israel, where secular culture is at least somewhat Jewish, you could stop being Jewish. You could go find a place to not be Jewish if you really wanted to. But that also means that you can choose to be Jewish, and that your Jewishness can be something you choose to identify with, instead of it just being forced, instead of being something that you just do because you've always done it, and someone taught you to do it once and you never stopped. And there's something much loftier from that, starting from Purim. Questions? Anything?
So, interesting that he also brings up Rav Kook. I was always a big fan of Rav Kook's philosophy, the concept of Orot HaKodesh. He discusses this concept of purpose. Mashmot in, our actions that actually represent a specific purpose. The I versus the discussion that we did with Rav Aaron. There's the individual, the communal, the national. And here it seems that Rav Shagar is putting more focus on the anarchical concept, which is, basic definition of anarchy is a concept of everyone is...
it's very individualistic. 100%. Rav Shagar is a Dr. Lumi rabbi, which means he is born into and steps into the chain of Rav Kook's sort of followers, but he is 100% one of the followers who emphasizes the individual over the whole. He very much sees it as a corrective, that there are in fact aspects within Rav Kook's teachings that focus on the individual that were not emphasized by many of Rav Kook's students, in particular sort of streams of thought. There's an article written by Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Brandis, currently head of Michal Herzog, where I studied. He wrote an article called Orot HaAdam, Lights of the Person, about the humanistic and individualistic passages in Rav Kook that were sort of forgotten about. Some because they were published and then forgotten, and some because they were in Rav Kook's notebooks, Shemot Fatzim, that were never themselves published until fairly recently. And so there's a whole stream of modern Dati Leumi rabbis who have really rediscovered aspects of Rav Kook that very much focus on the individual and things.
So first of all, send that to me. Secondly, so how do you think Rav Shagar would reconcile this concept of the focus on the individual, the importance of the individual's choices, versus the concept of a national purpose? Or a concept of a singular divine, I guess, mandate?
So that is a much larger question, and it gets into questions of whether we can ever talk about there being a large story like that, a one divine story that's happening from the beginning of creation to the end and things like that, which Rav Shagar would not agree with. Slightly smaller stories like, okay, what we're doing here in Israel and the purpose of the nation now and stuff like that, he's probably slightly more comfortable with, much more into individual things, often because we cannot know more than that. And the larger discussion of that would be far beyond the context of...
What's this chirut that he's talking about then? Wouldn't that be something more like divine?
Right, so this chirut, in Rav Kook's original context, 100% is knowing your identity within the nation, and the nation's identity and purpose within the world and the cosmos and whatever. Rav Shagar is focusing on the specific aspect of you have a nature, an identity that just exists as who you are. You are an Orthodox Jew who grew up in America, who lives in Israel, and that defines you, and you have to act according to that.
That's my chofesh or my...
That's your chirut. Is the ability to really express that. And your chofesh is the ability to say, well, what if I want to be something else?
But isn't he saying that it starts from chofesh and then goes to chirut? Like
it doesn't have to, but he's saying that's a possibility we have, is the ability to choose to be that person.
Oh, interesting.
Anything else? Okay, thank you guys very much for your time.